Hi everyone, welcome back to Real Talk, our campus weekly video series where we discuss relationships, empathy, advocacy, and life. All of our episodes are pre-recorded and released every Tuesday at 5 p.m. on our IGTV and Facebook page through the YouTube link. Today we're going to be talking about survivors with disabilities and their lived experiences and the ways in which they can experience trauma related to sexual or domestic violence, and really bring light to kind of the different experiences they may have in accessing resources or lack thereof, and what we can do to support survivors of disabilities. So we thought it would be helpful to start the episode by describing or defining the different types of disabilities folks may have, and then also how some may be a result of trauma, whereas some may have been a part of that person's life and identity prior to experiencing the trauma. So I have my little handy dandy list here. So we have different types of disabilities include vision impairment, deaf or hard of hearing, mental health conditions, intellectual disability, acquired brain injury, autism spectrum disorder, and physical disability. So these are just the lists of some different types of disabilities that people may have. Obviously, those are just kind of like broad categories. A lot of different kind of disorders or disabilities can fall under those categories. And in particular, when we think about the ones that might be acquired due to or as a result of the trauma that they experienced, the two that we were kind of talking about in preparation this episode was mental health conditions such as PTSD, anxiety, depression, etc., or the acquired brain injury. So for people who are in abusive relationships, if there's violence, that can be something that can be acquired due to trauma, is a brain injury.
Yeah, definitely.
So these are different types of disabilities that people may have prior to trauma or as a result of trauma. But I think the important, place maybe to start with this conversation is like how they might experience the abuse or trauma in the first place, like what that may look like for people.
Yeah, definitely.
It does look different for people who are able-bodied or who don't have disabilities in that way.
Yeah. And it's definitely, there's like a disparity in the power in the relationship. So you can definitely see with people with disabilities how dangerous it can become when their abuser ends up being their caregiver, because the caregiver role is very common in the community with people with disabilities. If they need that caregiver, how do we like measure whether or not that caregiver is giving appropriate care?
Yeah, exactly.
And whether or not the person who is receiving care is comfortable with everything going on in that relationship, it can be difficult to kind of identify because they might not have the communication tools, or they might communicate in a different way that most people don't understand. So really looking out for those signs within the community of people with disabilities. And it can be different for each, I want to say child because I worked with children with disabilities, but obviously not all victims are children. And you have to look at like how adults with disabilities share their experience.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned like the caregiver and like power dynamic, because I feel like that's a huge part of the conversation. Is there are varying obviously disabilities that will impede on someone's life in different ways, right? So there are some people that are dependent on others to take care of them, right? To take care of their basic needs, help them bathe, help them go to the bathroom, whatever that may look like. And then there are those with disabilities who are independent, right, and able to kind of function in different ways in their life, and may only need some assistance with certain things, or not at all, or whatever that may look like for them. I think for those who are dependent on a caregiver, that power dynamic is really important for children and or for adults. And the way, and I even think of like elderly, people, and they're reliant on people taking care of them. Even just thinking of like, people with Alzheimer's and things like that, that really, we talk about consent and what consent means. And one of the pieces about consent that someone cannot give consent if they don't understand the concept of it. So there are people with certain types of intellectual disabilities who may not understand what consent even means, or may not understand what they're consenting to in that moment. So I think about what you were giving an example of a caregiver. if someone is, they're responsible for giving that their patient or the person they're taking care of, it could be a family member, right, as their caregiver too, or a nurse or whatever it may look like, who is maybe responsible for bathing that person, that, requires conversation, even if the person may not understand a lot about, how to take care of themselves and how to be able to do that for themselves. Still respecting them as a human being and respecting their dignity and respecting their autonomy. And even with like kids, and I've heard conversations about like, still including them in the conversation by saying, okay, it's time for your bath, or it's time to change your diaper or something like that. Like, can we do that right now, or do you want to wait 5 minutes? That way you're still, you have to do it, but you're still giving them a little bit of agency, a little bit of choice, right? In like when it's happening or something of that nature,
They still have control over their choices.
Exactly.
They know it's going to happen, but it's not necessarily being forced upon them.
Right. And then explaining, like, okay, I'm going to touch you, I'm going to like, maybe, I remember I was watching a training where the person was talking about a client they were working with who was in a wheelchair and had slid down a little bit in the chair. So they went to pick them up and kind of just sit them upright. And they were like, I didn't even think about asking them, like, hey, is it okay if I lift you up? I've noticed that you're like, you slid down a little bit. Can I, put my hands under your arms to like lift you up? And that was just communication, to give that person a little bit of control and agency. So
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And I noticed in like my work with children in the schools, just asking permission, it evens out that relationship. It lets them know that you are there to help them, but you're not going to force them to make decisions that they're not comfortable with.
Right.
And I think that's such like an important piece of it, because it's so easy for it would have been so easy for me to go in and just be like, okay, well, I know we need to do this, we need to do this, we need to do this, and just do it with them and be like, we're doing this. But that would completely negate their experience in that too. So you need to really take a step as like the caregiver. It is your responsibility to take that step back and say, okay, where is their role in this? How can I include their decision making? Yeah. And I think that is something that is easily abused, and whether or not people realize it, it's definitely a big piece of it.
Yeah, they're a hugely vulnerable population, particularly those who rely on caregivers for, experiencing sexual violence, experiencing abuse, neglect, right? And so that's a population that's often left out of the conversation when we talk about domestic and sexual violence. And really, and kind of the other piece of our conversation today is about accessing different resources. So, for the folks who are not able to live as independently and rely on others who care for them, that barrier to accessing resources or help or support if they need it is just huge, because like we were mentioning before, that power, dynamic in the relationship, if they're not able to take care of themselves physically, right? They're not able to bathe themselves or go to the bathroom or walk or whatever that may look like, then the person who's taking care of them probably is going to prevent them from having access to a phone to reach out for help, or have access to a device where they can contact someone for support. And then they also face the barrier of, am I going to be believed if I bring this forward? Is someone going to take me seriously? Because a lot of those abusers can also use their disability as an excuse of saying, oh, they don't know what they're talking about.
They don't know what they're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. And like minimize the experience.
And if they get the law enforcement involved, are the law enforcement going to understand? I know I was reading something, and I think it was only about 10% of the alleged perpetrators were arrested in cases that were reported to law enforcement.
Wow.
And it's so low, because whether or not they understand what the abuse is. I mean, it could be something as simple as not giving medication at the right time, like they're withholding their medication or overdosing them so they'll be compliant. And it's something that like most people would not even think to look at as a way of abuse, but that is very abusive to somebody who may be relying on that medication to help them. It could help ease their pain. I mean, I know a lot of the medications given to people with disability is just to help with their quality of life. So
Yeah.
And then also like the financial abuse and extortion that happens by caregivers with them. The caregiver could easily say, oh, well, I was using it to get their food. I was using it to do this for them, and easily turn it on the victim when clearly it's an abuse of power.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think the other kind of piece to this are for the folks who are maybe able to function more independently in their lives. Maybe their impairment, they have a visual impairment, or they're deaf or hard of hearing, but they're able to kind of live more independently and take care of themselves in different ways, and function that way, be more like self-sufficient, right? Things like that.
Yeah.
But if they experience, maybe the abuse they experience is not at the hands of like a caregiver, but they experience assault from a coworker, from a friend, from a partner, they also face then those barriers of accessing different resources. Are they going to be able to know who they can contact? Are they going to be able to communicate well with that person for them to understand the dynamics of what's going on, or the needs that person might have? I think of particularly like, this is so frustrating to me, like when people meet someone who is blind or has a visual impairment, and for whatever reason, and it's maybe well-intentioned, but they just like think, oh, because they're blind, I'm going to talk really loudly and really slowly. And, and you're like, what? Like, that has nothing to do, but people just, I think, get tripped up, like when they're met with a person with a disability and they don't know how to act around them. And I think like all just like regular human nature just like falls out the window, because they think they have to do all these things that are not required, and then don't even think to ask the person, how can I best assist you, or like, what can I do to take care of you right now. So I think that creates another barrier of like, am I, as if the person who has the disability feels, am I going to have to now teach this person how to talk to me or how to treat me? Like,
just an added thing.
It's exhausting, I can imagine. So I think that's another huge piece of it, is like, are they going to even, feel safe accessing, in addition to just feel able to access those resources.
And not have to worry about explaining themselves twice, or explain their communication style and then move forward into disclosing something that is very hard to disclose in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think about what you said in the beginning of like the, and what we're kind of preparing in this episode for, about the different types of disabilities that can be a result of trauma. So, one of which is some of the mental health conditions or disorders that people might get as a result of trauma, and PTSD and things like that. And then also for those who are in abusive relationships, or abuse at their home, maybe by a family member, where they could have a brain injury as a result of that, and what that can look like long-term for that individual. And so that's also may impact even just their understanding of their experience. And, I think also mental health conditions aren't always recognized as a disability, which is like, in and of itself. It's obviously like, it's going to be different in how it impacts someone's life versus a physical disability and things of that nature, but it still impedes on their daily functions or their life in some way.
And when it's mental health, I feel like more people are, I feel people just like get into almost this like judgy space, and they're like, oh, well, if you just do this and this, it'll stop, or do this and you'll feel better. Oh, just try to be positive. And it's just like, no, that
doesn't work that way.
Doesn't work that way. Like, recommending services or showing them, I know, like, if you have somebody who likes social media, have them follow a few survivor accounts, or have them follow some like mindfulness accounts. So it'll just pop up in their daily, when they're swiping through on Instagram, they'll might have like a mindfulness pop up, and that could be helpful in just stopping those anxious thoughts that might be constantly rolling around in their brain, or their depressive thoughts, or they're in a really, like, if they're in like that fight or flight mode and they're just trying to distract themselves and they see that pop up, it might help. So just understanding that positivity is not the only way to make a change is also really helpful.
And can be toxic. You know,
It can be super toxic.
I've been happy to see a lot of people posting about what toxic positivity does for
Yes.
folks, especially right now during the pandemic, of like constantly being inundated with like, make the best of it, be productive, da da da. And it's like, we're struggling. Like, this is like national, international trauma that we're all experiencing right now, and everyone handles it differently. So it may be really unhelpful to hear someone say like, well, just make the best of your situation. Like, I think that's the other issue with folks with disabilities, no matter what the disability, whether it's a physical or an emotional or, you know, mental health, I mean, or something intellectual, where people might have the attitude of like, you know, well, just, you know, you'll figure it out, make it work kind of thing.
Yeah.
And, like,
and there's an expectation that they're going to be happy all the time.
Right.
And forgetting that we all have spectrums of emotions, and expecting somebody to just sit on one end of the spectrum is super hard to expect of somebody. I mean, you wouldn't expect somebody to constantly be energetic. You expect them to take a nap. You expect them to go to sleep. You expect them to take a break. Why can't we do that with our emotions?
Right. And also honoring the fact that people with disabilities are people. Like,
yes.
I don't know why, like, you know, no matter what the range of function, right, or independence may look like for that person, that people, like I was saying before, kind of forget how to treat someone when they have someone with a disability in front of them, and just forget common manners or politeness or, you know, like regular human interaction. And that can really other people with disabilities and make them feel isolated. And it also makes them feel like, you know, who is a safe person that I can go to if I'm not even treated like a person with my own thoughts and feelings or choices. And obviously depending on, you know, where they are in their ability to function independently and all that. But yeah, I think it's sad with how much of abuse is probably, or not probably, statistically happening to people with disabilities, and how little of it is actually reported. And then once it is reported, like you were saying, who's actually getting the support that they need? And you know,
are they able to even able to go into the shelters, or the shelters that are available to them functional for them? Are they able, like, do they have stairs and this person's in a wheelchair? If they're in a wheelchair, they can't get up those stairs. And do the people at the shelter know how to sign in American Sign Language or in a variety of dialects within the sign language? I mean, depending on where you're from, even in the US, you might have different colloquialisms in your signs that certain people might not understand. So having that basic understanding of ASL can be super helpful for like shelters and different centers to be aware of. And then also having things available for in Braille, like I know most shelters, they have like books and stuff, and they have things for the survivors to do while they are at the shelter. And are those things like appropriate for people with disabilities? Are they accessible?
Right.
So,
and not forgetting that people with disabilities, like whether they have a visual impairment or they're deaf or hard of hearing, still use social media. Like I think that's another thing people don't cat in the background that people don't realize for some reason, that like even just because someone has a visual impairment or they're deaf or hard of hearing, that they may not be on social media. But that's especially why like people are trying to be cognizant of, and I know we do this on our social media too, of either making the visuals, the contrast easier for people with visual impairments to see themselves. So like having more contrast in the colors between the text and the background, you know, and things that are easier to read, easier to see in that way, and or adding an image description or a photo description in the caption. And that can be for videos or photos and things. And I've thought about too, you know, if anyone who is watching this or listening to this, if it would be helpful for us to add the auto-generated captions, because I know Instagram now does that. Sometimes they're not always accurate, which is I think why we haven't done it. But if that would be helpful for students, like I would be really curious if that would be something they would like us to do. But there's always ways that you can make things on social media or online more accessible to folks who still use devices, even if they have a visual impairment and things. You know, there's a lot of like tools and apps on phones that allow people with visual impairments where they can use an app to read out to them like what the text says and things like that. So it's still very much accessible to people online, even if they aren't able to always see what is, you know, being posted. So there's lots of different ways to reach that community, even in the same ways that we reach others, but in different ways and making it just more accessible. You know,
Yeah,
makes sense.
for sure.
Yeah. So I think maybe our kind of final thought place where we want to take this conversation was kind of how to spot the signs and or how to support people with disabilities who may have experienced domestic or sexual violence. So maybe do we want to start with like how to spot some signs and be kind of an upstander, or how to help?
Yeah. So, I mean, when you're, words are really hard, sorry.
Got this.
I had a train of thought going and it completely went out of my brain.
Oh my God, that always happens to me.
Happens, okay. But I think when you're looking at how you can help, the first and biggest thing would be believe survivors. Believe what they are telling you. You're never going to get in trouble with believing somebody. And if it turns out that the abuse isn't happening, at least you were there to support that person and they knew they had a support in you.
Right.
You created a safe space for them. And I think believing them is so important. And then not making assumptions based on how people appear or their communication styles is a big piece of it. Just understanding that they may communicate a certain way and it's up to you to find a way to understand that. So if you're seeing a behavioral outburst, that might not be that they're just having a behavior. Behavior always serves a purpose. So trying to find what that behavior's purpose is, whether or not it's they are just having a hard time or they're struggling because something is happening to them. And if you're seeing an increase in behaviors, that usually means that something else is happening. Yeah. So just being aware of what those behaviors mean.
Yeah. And I think too, like we talked a lot about earlier, the abusers potentially being the caregivers, but that's obviously not always the case. I mean, their statistics are high for that, but there's a lot of folks who are, you know, family members taking care of their family members. Maybe it's a sibling or a child or, oh, hi, cat. So cute. You can leave him in the screen. It's okay.
He's just decided he wants to be a part of our real talk today.
I'm listening. Yeah, I think like, you know, for the people who have someone in their life who has a disability, so maybe it's their family member, maybe it's their friend, maybe it's someone in their close like inner circle or something, and they're noticing those shifts, you know, maybe and that they are, you know, get scared or nervous to be touched. And that might be a sensory thing. You know, obviously we don't want to make the assumption that it's abuse, but it is something to take note of, right? And that's where I think those conversations that we mentioned earlier about consent are really important, and boundaries, you know, like having just all the conversations all the time, as many times as you can, to enforce boundaries in that relationship that you have with that person, but also trying to show them what a safe relationship can look like, right? The more we can model what a safe relationship looks like for people with disabilities, the more hopefully it makes it, I guess, accessible for them to be able to reach out for help, right? That they're going to be able to know that they're not at fault, that they weren't the one who caused it, right? That they deserve support or help and that what happened to them was not okay, no matter where kind of on the spectrum of disabilities they may be, that they're still deserving of help in that. And, you know, they face all the same, you know, I was gonna say barriers, but just the things that, you know, people go through of like, it was my fault, I deserved it, I asked for it or whatever, like all those victim blamey thoughts that a lot of survivors have, who don't have disabilities. A lot of survivors with disabilities have all the same thoughts, you know, and things and feelings that may prevent them. So we want to make sure, particularly for a population that is extremely vulnerable, that we emphasize, like, this was not your fault. You deserve to feel safe, and this person should not have done that to you. So the more that we can model that for the people in our lives, the safer it becomes for them.
Yeah, and I think it's our duty as advocates to become aware of those services that we can link to help people who are coming to us who may have disabilities. How can we best serve you? What services best serve you?
Absolutely.
And just like finding that path.
Yeah, definitely. And I think on that note, for anyone who's listening or watching who may suspect that there might be abuse happening to someone that in your life with a disability, or if you have a disability and you have experienced any type of domestic or sexual violence, and you would like to reach out for support, I want to just list our hotlines and know that we're available for you. So our 24/7 hotlines are 203-731-5204 and 203-731-5206. So you can call those anytime, whether you're the friend of someone or the loved one of someone who has experienced domestic or sexual violence, or if you yourself have experienced it or think you have. Just know that we're here for you to help you process it and connect you to other resources that you may need. So I think that wraps up our conversation, unless you have anything else you want to add.
I do not. I think that was a great wrap up.
Yeah, cool. So for anyone listening, if you have any thoughts, feedback, questions, suggestions, again, if you think the auto-generated captions would be helpful, we'd be happy to try them out. Let us know if there's any ways that we can be more accessible to you all. And please continue to watch our episodes, listen to our episodes, let us know your thoughts. All these episodes are pre-recorded, released every Tuesday, again at 5 p.m. on IGTV and Facebook and YouTube link. So share with your friends and tune in next week. Thanks for listening.